Christopher Harding, and you're listening to Thriving in Business and Life.
And I am Will Wilkinson, and our topic this week is the genius of inclusion. And as we get started here, I want to thank you, Chris, for that great title. I think putting genius and inclusion together is a masterstroke.
Well, and it really comes out of experience, because in working with groups, whether it was as a senior leader or an executive of a company, what I really found was that we were just far smarter as a group than any one of us was individually.
Right. And
that the perspectives I'd gain by bringing in people into the conversation, including people who knew nothing about the topic we were exploring, always provided us with a better look at what we were trying to accomplish.
Well, I think the brilliant part of this, which I'm so looking forward to unbundling during the call today, is the difference between kind of being aware of inclusion, the principle that you just spoke of, and being proactively engaged in using it as a tool.
Well, that's
what I really want to get into here.
Yeah, and we've got some good stories that we'll draw upon to illustrate that point, because it actually takes practice for most of us to get to that point that you're talking about.
Right.
We become far too dependent, it seems like, on our own sense of individual genius.
Yeah, well, in a way, we're discussing changing the default setting. Right? From being an individual who adds in other people's voices to being a communitarian where the expectation is it takes us all.
Right. Well, one of the first places where I remember experiencing a lack of inclusion in kind of what felt like an obvious way to me as an observer was I was consulting a client, and they'd been having trouble with engagement. They felt like people weren't fully participating, and in particular, they had certain aspects of the company, maybe different positions or different levels. In some cases, they wondered whether it was gender-based. And so I just sat in on some of their meetings and observed how the meeting ran, what went on. And anybody who hears this can probably relate in some way or another to having seen this or experienced it before. So imagine a meeting kind of in a conference room, and you've got maybe a senior leader there, a few other executives, maybe there's an executive assistant, maybe there's some frontline people, and they're having a conversation about a particular challenge. And, different ideas are being bandied about, and they're not coming up with a solution. And finally, the executive assistant kind of hesitantly speaks up and offers a suggestion. And it's almost like her words weren't heard. Like people are kind of like look at her and then they just continue on as if she didn't say anything.
Falling on deaf ears.
Yeah, totally. Well, a minute or two later, somebody else offered the exact same solution and was congratulated.
That's amazing. So it's as if they didn't hear the first time.
Right. I mean,
because of who said it.
Yeah, we've talked about brain blindness before. Right. There's also brain deafness, right? And so...
Well, now, how did she react to that?
Well, yeah, great question, because I watched that. I was sitting actually on the opposite corner of this long kind of curved table, and I watched her kind of just deflate.
Yeah.
You could literally see her deflate. And then when the other person was congratulated, you could see her actually sit up and almost like, hello. And it wasn't really, my place, so to speak, but they had asked me to speak up if I noticed anything. And so I just spoke up and said, excuse me, did you notice what just happened here? I said, this person just said something.
So, but when you raised that question, did they have any idea what you were talking about?
I could see that a couple of them did.
Okay.
Yeah, and of course she did.
Right.
And when I brought it up, her face went red. I think the fact that she suddenly, it was like I could tell this might be a risk for her. And since they'd called me in to address this, fortunately the senior executive was like very apologetic and said, wow,
What a
I'm
great
embarrassed.
lesson right there for them all to experience.
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't really script that. I mean, I know it's sad that some feelings got hurt, etc., but you can't really imagine a better scenario for learning this principle.
Well, and yeah, then the question was, do you mind if we take a moment, and just do a quick aside? And he was like, no, that's part of why we have you here.
Oh,
Thank you.
Great.
And so I just asked the question, when else and with whom else do you think this happens? And a couple of the frontline people, feeling emboldened by the openness of the senior executive, said, this happens all the time.
There you go. I was going to say that a moment ago. Sadly, this does happen all the time.
Yeah. And so, that's
So
one.
did they come to a point in that meeting of kind of grabbing it and being willing to be proactive?
Well, they did. And one of the first things, one of the other people, one of the guys in the meeting said, well, why didn't you speak up? He said to her. And he said it with kind of like an accusatory, why didn't you speak up? And so I waited to see what was going to happen for a second, and she was a little flustered. And the senior leader said, I don't think that's a fair question of her. And then he looked at me.
Right.
And I said, well, sure. Can you imagine from her standpoint what the risk is at speaking up in that situation?
Yeah. Big risk.
Yeah.
But it kind of is like blaming the victim.
Right. Yeah.
Which is done so often.
Yeah, far too often.
Yeah.
So, this whole idea of inclusion, I think if we look at different methodologies like Lean or Kaizen and so on, those are based in inclusionary models that came out of cultures that by nature are very group and consensus oriented. In the U.S., inclusion came about in part because of some of those practices, but even more so as an outgrowth of the diversity conversation. So,
well, it's always bottom line related too, and I think there's enough data proving that inclusion is far more profitable.
Here,
I mean, just to get kind of to the bottom line here.
Well, there totally is, and I think that the challenge was when diversity first started to be brought into the corporate mindset. It was really done around affirmative action and equal opportunity, and a lot of people took grand exception to that. But because government contracts were based on having diversity initiatives and being able to show that you were following equal opportunity mandates, companies began to infuse their teams and their departments and their organizations with more and more diversity. Well, what happened was they found that they were bringing diversity in, but much of the time they weren't retaining diverse candidates or employees because they weren't being utilized.
So they had the concept, they weren't executing.
Right, they were checking the box. They were bringing the people in, but not realizing that in order for a talented person to stay, they want to contribute. They want to feel like they're part of the success. So inclusion almost came about as an accidental addendum to diversity, that if you're going to retain your diverse talent, you have to start to include them.
Yeah, you have to do something with them.
Yeah, right. So now what began to happen is, as this process started, MIT, UCLA, BYU, I think it was University of Pennsylvania, all started to do these studies on, is a diverse group actually more effective than a homogeneous group?
Right.
And what they found is that when you get groups of people who have a similar background, think the same, and so on, in the tests they did, in the studies they did, they would be accurate on the problem solving and predictions that they were, challenged to make in these tests about 55% of the time.
Right, that's the homogeneous group.
Yeah. A little better than a flip of a coin if we're going to be, kind of true about it.
Yeah.
The diverse groups averaged about 75% accuracy.
Really?
Yeah,
that's a pretty substantial difference.
Well, and here's the funny part. And I love this stat because it just, shows our humanness. The homogeneous groups were far more confident in their decision than the diverse groups.
I know you and I have presented this, or I've seen the slides on this, and I just shake my head. So in other words, they were deluded. They were self-deluded to think that they were really being effective.
Well, yeah, and you think
Now, partly, I think you've described that or explained it, that they came to their decisions quicker.
right,
And
and
the
there was no disagreement. It was kind of like,
Yeah.
yep, that must
Yeah.
be it.
Yeah,
Groupthink.
yeah,
They were also perceived themselves as being more effective because they arrived
Yeah.
at their
Yeah.
decisions much more quickly.
right. That's amazing.
Yeah. So as
But like, what are the hurdles to get over? Because often good ideas are resisted, even though there's proof that they work. So what's the resistance to including people when there's genius involved?
well, first of all, you just hit it right squarely on the head. It is assuming that genius resides within each person in some way.
Yeah.
That everybody has a unique perspective, that there's something really worth understanding and mining from their life experience. Once I assume that and I get curious, so as soon as I see the word inclusion, to me the word that is directly, inextricably connected with it is curiosity.
Yeah.
That I
Right.
want to know this person's point of view because they're going to shine a different perspective or contribute a different perspective than I can see from where I stand.
Well, and to be fair, the problem we encountered there is the whole knowing mindset.
Right.
Where some innovators presented with the wall, scrawled on the wall is, "We don't do it that way around here."
Well, yes.
So
yes.
there's that to get through the crustiness of the status quo.
Well, and that brings up really when we look at an organization that's trying to incorporate difference or diversity, different perspectives. So you can start to look at difference in a variety of ways. It might be human differences like race and sex and background, education. It could be cultural differences, the way we think and see the world. It could be systems differences,
Right.
the different way we do things. As soon as you're starting to look at that, there's this. You talked about this. This isn't the way we do it around here. That's a product of what's called cultural assimilation, right? Now, there's a certain amount of assimilation that we want, right? We want people to assimilate to our mission
Right.
and our values and so on. Standard operating procedures, though Lean would challenge us to continue to improve upon those. So the question is, are we asking for too much assimilation? And in most cases, the answer is yes.
Right.
So diversity is seen almost as something we need to inoculate against.
Yeah.
You know?
It's a threat.
Yeah, if you have
And
a
I think
different way of thinking.
that's why a lot of companies sidestream innovation. They keep it separate from the mainstream because it is a threat, and they let it strengthen in the side stream before they flow it into the mainstream.
And that's actually interesting that that's becoming less and less the case now because of monetary constraints and so on. So innovation now, and especially in lean organizations, is an ongoing process kind of within the stream.
Yeah.
So you look at another form of how we deal with difference, cultural pluralism, right? Hey, I notice you do things different around here. That's cool, but do it over there, okay? Right. And there's a certain amount of that's legitimate. I mean, marketing has a way of doing things that isn't necessarily going to be the same as development.
Yeah.
But they need to respect each other's differences. But where you're really trying to get to is cultural inclusion, where I notice you do that different than I do. Show me how you do that.
Well, that's the thing, being curious. I loved your use of that word. And, in my work with clients, I really advocate leveraging imagination.
Right.
And I notice that a lot of us, by the time we reach adulthood, our imagination is almost atrophied. And I think it's because
sad,
it's
but true.
co-opted by media. We can just sit in a chair and watch all this imaginative stuff on the screen. But if we really get into our imagination, and Einstein felt that imagination was more important than knowledge, then we do get curious.
Right.
Because that's what imagination is.
Yeah.
It's curiosity about what could be.
Well, you asked the question I know a lot. I wonder if.
Yeah, what if?
What if, And, curiosity in a way is, kind of one of the words for me is, oh, tell me more about that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
that's a great way. So I'm assuming that there's some value in what this person is coming to share. And so, managing inclusion is a process that takes practice, and it, with organizations, as you know, that we work with, we have the bias monitor, a role that people
Right.
play that, we'll call out, hey, is there a bias at play here? They sometimes play the role of inclusion monitor too.
Mhm.
Hey, I notice these three people
Mhm.
haven't said anything.
Right.
Well, let's get their feedback. They've
Right.
been really listening,
Right.
carefully here. What do they have to share with us?
Well, to me, this is one of the more obvious depictions of the difference between surviving and thriving.
yeah, absolutely.
Because in the surviving model, you don't have time for that stuff. We're busy surviving here.
And as a matter of fact, like you said, it's a threat.
Yeah, it is a threat to the basic survival. That may be fine later, but not now. We're busy surviving. The thriving model, it's built in as a key component, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's an ongoing
Yeah,
component.
it's not an add-on option.
Well, and so sometimes it's we have something we call the thriving continuum, right?
Right.
And we draw, if you can picture a line going horizontally across the page from left to right.
Listeners will need to use their imagination for this.
That's right. And on the left-hand side of the page, you could see a little point that says same, right?
Uh-huh.
And on the opposite side of the continuum, different.
Okay, so it's a same to different continuum.
Right. And so our tendency as human beings, kind of if we're in human normal, right, is that we tend to talk to people who have our same experience. We're looking for confirmation of our ideas.
Right.
We enjoy having somebody we can share, our notions with. And that's great. And we might even say, well, these people look very different from me.
Mhm.
But the question is, do they have the same lens? Do they have the same
Yeah.
background?
Right.
Are they on the same level? Do they have the same job function?
Yeah.
All of those homogeneous aspects are going to tend to create groupthink.
Exactly.
So what I want to do is start to reach out across that continuum to more and different people. Now, I don't have to talk to everybody on the continuum, but I want to get representative samples so I get different ideas, different perspectives, and start to include that within our thinking. and
So
our
translate
decision-making.
that for us into this continuum that we're holding in our mind.
Yeah, so just picture like a little crosshatch going across maybe every, a third of the way, half the way, 3/4 of the way. I'm getting representative samples of people who are more different, have different backgrounds, different experiences, and so on. I'm talking to them about it. I'm getting their input. I'm not talking to everybody, but I'm trying to choose people who maybe have a unique perspective and who are maybe influential, because other people will start to listen to them. So what you're doing is you're not only doing reconnaissance, you're gathering information, but you're building a constituency.
Right.
You're building a sense of inclusion and
Yeah.
consensus, and even reaching out. And this is the tough one for people. If you look to the other end of the continuum, where the different is, that would be somebody who probably totally disagrees with you.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you seek them out with curiosity
Mhm.
and respect, and find out what is their perspective.
Mhm.
And you really listen to it, and hopefully incorporate some of their concerns or ideas into your thinking.
Well, if you're willing, Chris, I'd love you to tell the story about the semiconductor plant. This is one that
Right.
we put in the book, and it's in this chapter on inclusion, the genius of inclusion. And when you first told me this story, I thought, wow, what a great example of the cost in
Yeah.
hard dollars
Yeah.
of ignoring inclusion. And just well, go ahead and tell the story, because it's such a good one.
Well, so I was called in to, Silicon Valley to work with a company who basically manufactured silicon wafers. And they'd had an ongoing problem that, and I'm not an expert in their manufacturing process, but as I understood it, they kind of bake, so to speak, these wafers. And what was happening was on the graveyard shift that ran between midnight and 6 a.m., they overbaked a batch of wafers
Wow.
at the cost of about $100,000 in time
Whoa.
and materials. Right.
That's expensive burnt toast.
Totally. So they gathered together what they consider to be their key people. They got an engineer, they got a shift supervisor, they got one of their managers, They got somebody from the line, so they were trying to be inclusive, right? And they sorted through the problem, thought they had it figured out. So they implemented that fix, and a few weeks went by, and it had been fine, when lo and behold, it happened again.
Mm.
And now, okay, $200,000, right? Has gone up in smoke, so to speak. And, they call me up and go, hey, can you come in and help us here? Apparently there's something we're not seeing.
So they had their best men and women on this, and they couldn't solve the problem.
Yeah, as far as what they consider to be their best. Right. So I come in, and as I arrive that morning, I can see there's already upset going on. It's happened a third time.
Oh my! So that's $300,000.
$300,000, and I think it actually turned out to be more than that. But I'm in a meeting with this group of people, and as they were describing things, and I was listening to them, I'm often there as an observer initially, and I heard them talking through it and frustration, and I said, "Can I ask a question?" And the plant manager said, "Yeah, please." I said, "Who haven't you talked to about this?"
What a great question.
And you could see the defensiveness arise because they're in survival mode at this point, right? There's an amygdala hijack going on.
Right.
So there's not a lot of openness at this stage. And a couple of people said, we've got our A-team here. We've talked to everybody that matters. And they listed off the people they talked to. And, that was almost like, please don't hit us with this mushy, touchy-feely stuff. And they were trying to go back, and I went, well, hold on a second. So you've got your A-team together, but so far, with your A-team involved, it's cost you $300,000, and you don't know what's wrong.
Right.
So let me ask again, who haven't you spoken to? Well, finally, I think it was the evening shift supervisor, she spoke up and said, we really haven't talked to maintenance. And there was a couple of almost like, come on.
Yeah.
Like, what would they know?
Right.
So the plant manager, you can see the light bulb go on his head. He said, hey, has he left yet? He's talking about the night maintenance lead. And somebody rushed out of the room, and he was just clocking out, so they brought him in and said, hey, we're dealing with this problem. It happened again last night. Is there anything that you maybe can think of or that you are aware of, something different that happened? And so he shared this event that he'd seen all three times, which was a power fluctuation that showed up in how the air conditioning functioned and what happened with the lights. And they're like, wow. And he said, I shared this with the shift engineer, and he said it was not related.
He said it was not
related.
Okay.
Yeah. Now again, he was probably listening with brain blindness, brain deafness, right? I mean, what could this guy possibly know?
Right.
So they immediately went after that and found out that in fact that was the actual cause.
Right there under their noses.
Yeah, $300,000 later.
Yeah.
Because somebody they didn't consider to know enough to be a contributor. Actually had the vital information.
So, I've heard this story a number of times, and of course it's in our book. I've never asked you what the fallout was long term. Do you have any idea what that company did long term?
I do. They're a major player in that world at this point. They were growing to be a major player. They now are a major player. But here's something they did that they adopted that I thought was, again, we're talking about genius here. I thought their response to this was wonderful. One, that the plant manager had the humility, you could say, and the curiosity and the willingness to recognize that they could be brain blind, that their own biases could be influencing how they dealt with this. But secondly, that he actually stopped, he allowed us to seek this out, and then afterwards he instituted a policy that initially became unique with their plant and eventually spread throughout the whole company. They called it the inclusion inventory. It was the first agenda item on any important meeting they had. And what it said was inclusion inventory. And they literally had these words written out. Who else needs to be in this room to discuss the topics we're discussing today?
Wow. This is so practical, Chris, because I'm just imagining the range of possibilities for our listeners.
Yeah.
In life, in organizations, if we took up the challenge, the opportunity to institute that kind of preemptive strategy, you're not waiting for the semiconductor disaster. You're including inclusion as the first line item. I mean, I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, and they would literally, if they realized that they were covering a couple of topics that needed other input, they would reposition those later in the meeting to make sure they could send somebody out to repopulate that meeting with a couple of other people who had maybe unique perspectives. And then they would cover other items so that when they got to those real, critical items, they had the right kind of diversity in the room.
Well, let's go big picture here for a little moment and then apply it locally, because we're in America in a context now where the opposite seems to be happening, and it's not new, but kind of stocking the pond politically with the people who all think the same.
Right, yeah, that's kind of been the traditional way of doing politics.
Yeah, and it's just continuing that way. How do we meet that? And I think here's where we go local, into our own communities. But how do we bring these thriving principles, this one is the genius of inclusion, to bear locally where we live?
Well, one of the things, if you start out and start with your family, start with you as a couple, if you're, coupled up with somebody, and ask yourself the question, are we talking about positions that we're taking, or are we talking about interests? So let's go. We'll flash
what a
back
distinction.
to flash back to the silicon company, wafer company. The position was we have all the right people in the room. The interest was we need to fix this.
Yeah.
If we can get back to interests, right, and needs.
Because the interest is what's practical.
Yeah, and the interest is really what we're after. The position is typically ego-based.
Yeah.
It's political in some way or another, right? And so whether it's in my family with me and my wife, whether it's in the community, what are the real interests and needs that we have? And let's set aside our positions and start to figure out how can we genuinely ensure that we solve this particular challenge.
Well, this is frankly revolutionary, to change the lens from jousting positions to facing and really strategizing to fulfill the actual interests.
Well, unfortunately, it is revolutionary, right? But I think, to a certain extent, human nature has grown. If we look at it anthropologically, we started out kind of tribally, and the other was suspect.
Yeah.
Well, as we've become more and more enmeshed in culture and race and gender and all these different things, what maybe worked in an era thousands of years ago is merely and totally antiquated for today's complex problems.
And as usual, we lag behind.
Well, yeah. I mean, when you think about it, if we're kind to ourselves, you realize that probably our DNA has to be upgraded.
Well, that, and also our brains need some rewiring.
Yes.
And fortunately, they can do that. And we'll talk about that in later programs. The neuroplasticity factor. We're realizing that we can change.
And that's fortunate. So we've got a lot more to cover with this. We're actually going to get into next week how love as a real way of being becomes an important part of inclusion because of neuroplasticity.
And I love your way of describing that. We're going to use the L word.
Right. Yeah, we're going to use the L word next week. So if you have comments or ideas about thriving in business and life, send them to thrivinginbusinessandlife@gmail.com. Special welcome to our New Zealand listeners, also our listeners from Mexico. Always happy to have more people joining us.
Thank you, Chris. This has been Chris Harding, and
you are Will Wilkinson.
Good to have you with us on Thriving in Business and Life. Talk to you again next week.